let's say I'm going to represent the performance of your machine. So let's say that this right here is the total performance of your hardware. This is your hardware performance.
Yeah.
Okay, so green is hardware performance. And then blue is going to be your host operating system. So Windows is always going to have some overhead, right? Just to run Windows, you need a little bit of RAM, needs a little bit of CPU just to run, right? So you have some what we call overhead. You have some overhead just to run it, even if you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we said, okay, in our example, well, we want to run another Windows machine, right? Again, we're talking about the total performance of your machine here. So we want to run another Windows machine. And we want to run pfSense, which doesn't take quite as much, but still takes a little bit. And we want to run, let's see. Okay, let's use, and we want to run Linux as well. So we're running 3 operating systems. And even without doing anything on any of those operating systems, we're actually running 4 of them, right? We're running 1 guest and 3 hosts.
Yeah.
Even if we're not doing anything, it actually still takes sort of quite a bit of performance, right? We have all that overhead.
Yeah.
So this is the problem with virtualization, is that it has quite a bit of overhead. Especially, so Linux obviously is quite lightweight. Something like isn't pfSense isn't very lightweight. I mean, FreeBSD is, but then pfSense, the firewalling operating system, isn't. It's not super lightweight.
Okay.
Windows is like particularly heavy.
Yeah.
So this is what happens when you just do basic virtualization. So basic VMs, virtual machines. You're running the entire operating systems multiple times.
Okay.
One really cool thing that you can do in Linux, though, is like the next step in the evolution of virtualization, where you have your Linux machine. So first of all, let's say you're running a big Linux machine, right? So big overhead like Windows. Usually it would be much smaller, but let's say worst case scenario. Well, what you can do is you use a technology. So if what you want to do is run other Linux VMs, so you always have that Linux core, right? You have that somewhere in here. You have the Linux core that's running, right?
Yeah.
What you want to do is run multiple instances of Linux. Maybe there are different distributions, sure, but like you want to run multiple instances of the same Linux core, right?
Yeah.
So why bother creating the same overhead multiple times when what you can do is just have very little overhead, like very, very little overhead, and just ask them to refer to the Linux core. And suddenly, each box, we're going to give them the specific name afterwards, each little box here, each operating system that you run is still isolated from each other, but is going to refer to resources that already exist on the host.
Okay.
Right. And so we call this. Do you have an idea what we call this? Maybe you've heard of it before.
I don't think so.
Okay, we call these containers.
Yeah, no, haven't heard of it before.
And so containers. So the only problem is that containers only run on Linux, in the sense that it doesn't. So the most famous container software is Docker, or container framework, I guess you could say, is Docker. You also have, let's see, very low level container technology. So what's so funny is I actually have, I'll put that in the description and I'll send it to you as well. There's a really good video that explains how containers work, and it's fantastic, and it has to do with namespaces in Linux. I guess it's a bit more specific to Linux and how Linux works and stuff, but it's super interesting if you want to have a look at it. It's super interesting. But like, so Docker is a framework. You can use it with, so other softwares that use Docker would be, for instance, Kubernetes. that use Docker. Docker is I believe it is open source, but it is at least free to use.
Okay.
So you can install Docker. And then you have like much lower level container technology would be LXC. So for instance, if you really want to like delve deep into how containers work, you would be using LXC.
Okay.
The equivalent for VMs, so we have right now VMware. So that's what we're going to be using. VMware Workstation is what we're going to be using to run VMs. Low level. So when I say low level, I mean close to the machine.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I said LXC is low level, and I assumed you knew what it meant. But yeah, low level means very close to the machine. It doesn't mean simple. In fact, it means quite the contrary, because there is very little abstraction. Right? We're not simplifying things. We're very close to the machine.
Okay.
And so, very low level virtualization software would be KVM, for instance. KVM, which is open source and free, but I believe I'm actually not sure. No, and you know what? I'm not going to say anything. I'm not sure if VMware uses KVM. I know another so the virtualization software, we call that a hypervisor.
Okay.
Hypervisor. And so, hold on, I'll just make a quick search because I can never remember which one is type 1 and which one is type 2. Hypervisor type 1 and 2. Okay, yeah. So you have on the one hand, you have type 1 hypervisors, which is what we're going to be using, which we call also like hosted hypervisor. So type 1 is you have a Windows install and you're running the VMware software on that Windows install.
Okay.
And type 2, and this is where it gets really cool. Type 2 hypervisor means you're not even running Windows. Like what you're running bare metal is the hypervisor.
Oh.
So it's a special operating system, right? So let's draw the performance of your machine again. It's a special hypervisor that has usually extremely low overhead, extremely little overhead, right?
Yeah.
And that hypervisor, like that operating system, is your hypervisor. This thing here is the hypervisor.
Okay.
So usually in a like if you want a server, a virtualization server, you will run a type 2 hypervisor. And one of the type 2 hypervisors, there is one from VMware, which is VMware ESXi. VMware ESXi. But you need a license to use it. And also, I've tried installing ESXi on my personal server. It's not simple. You need to install drivers for the NIC and stuff. It's not simple.
Oh.
Personally, like what I like to use is an open source type 2 hypervisor called Proxmox. It is Linux based.
Yeah.
And it runs, so it's going to run VMs using KVM. So that is the very low level software that runs VM. So it's going to be using KVM to run VMs. And it can also run containers using LXC.
Okay.
Right. It also has a bunch of other features and stuff. So Docker is a container framework. And it technically does run on Windows as well, but it doesn't make much sense to run it on Windows. So when you run Docker on Windows, and this is where we stopped, when you run Docker on Windows, what ends up happening is you're actually just running virtualization software. So the way it works is you have your normally here is what happens with Docker. You have your Linux operating system, your host operating system. And inside that host, you're going to be running the Docker daemon, the Docker application. So here we're going to make Docker, a bit of a magic box, Docker. And what Docker is going to do is Docker is going to say, okay, I'm going to create containers. So those are like separate instances of Linux.
Okay.
And Docker, the app, is going to manage those containers, those Linux containers. But for instance, if we look from a physical perspective, we only have one machine, right? We only have one physical machine. But from a logical perspective, it behaves a lot like VMs, virtual machines, where from a logical perspective, it's like we actually have 5 machines. It's 5 operating systems running.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is, let's say that this is the Linux core. So I said that containers sort of need access to the Linux core. That's not exactly true. They actually have access to a lot more than the Linux core. For instance, like a lot of daemons, essentially a lot of, how would I explain that? A lot of applications running on Linux that require administrator access. So things like the clock, for instance. Clock is a good example. So let's say your Linux host has a clock, right? So it says it is like 9 p.m., for instance. So the Linux host has a clock. Then every other container here, instead of having their own separate clock, they're just going to refer back to the clock of the host.
Okay.
And you have a bunch of systems like that where the containers don't do it themselves, they just ask the host. And you don't have to run the same piece of software multiple times.
Okay.
If you were to make virtual machines, each virtual machine has its own dedicated clock, even if they're Linux virtual machines.
Well, then how does Docker work with Windows?
That's a great question. The answer is it kind of doesn't.
Then what's the point of having it?
It does work. It does work in the sense that Docker is made to manage Linux containers. From what I know, to my knowledge, it's not possible to run Windows containers in Docker. It might be possible, but in which case I believe it would just create a virtual machine anyway, because I don't see how that'd be possible. But in the case of Docker on Windows, you'd have the Windows operating system. You'd have the Docker app or Docker daemon.
Yeah.
And then what Docker will do is first it will create a Linux VM, right? First it will create a Linux VM. And then inside that Linux VM, it'll actually create containers.
Okay.
So like you have that extra layer, right?
Yeah.
Right. This is why, by the way, and I guess this is more of a piece of trivia than anything. If you're interested in trying Docker out, which I recommend you do, it's very interesting. But I guess it requires a bit of some knowledge on Linux. But if you ever want to try a Docker, if you want to install Docker on Windows, Docker for Windows requires Hyper-V, which is the Windows. It's the Windows hypervisor. It's the Windows hypervisor.
Okay.
Right? So it's a virtualization software that can come natively with Windows 10. And I believe it doesn't necessarily come with every edition of Windows, though. You can't really... I don't know that you can just download it from anywhere. I believe it's a service you have to activate, and it's a bit of a mess. But if you want to run Docker on Windows, you need to get Hyper-V to work on Windows. Which makes sense because you're going to be running a Linux VM.
Yeah.